the greatest betrayals are always delivered by the people who have the deepest understanding of your weaknesses. They know the location of your soft spots, the price of your loyalty, and the precise moment when you are at your most vulnerable. In the entire arc of my life, I have rarely witnessed a loyalty so profound, or a betrayal so absolute, as the one that unfolded between Elias Vance and his partner, Gregory Thorne. It was the cost of a success they had built, brick by exhaustive brick, a price tag attached to the very fabric of their $100 million company. Quantum Leap Solutions. Elias was the engine, the unseen force humming in the server room, his mind a labyrinth of logic and innovation that consistently birthed the impossible. He possessed the rare gift of seeing 5 years into the technological future, not merely predicting trends, but engineering the solution before the problem was fully understood. His office, a modest space tucked away on the highest floor, rarely saw daylight. Its walls were covered in whiteboards scarred by complex equations, and the only soundtrack was the faint, rhythmic whir of cooling fans protecting the proprietary servers. He measured his achievements not in dollars, but in efficiency, elegance, and the seamless functionality of the groundbreaking algorithms that underpinned their entire enterprise. He was, to his core, an engineer who had inadvertently become a mogul. Gregory, or Greg, as he insisted on being called, was the architect of their public image, the gleaming, polished brass of the operation. He was charisma in a tailored suit, a man whose handshake could secure a multi-million-dollar contract before the client had finished their espresso. Greg thrived on the applause of investors, the flash of the cameras at tech conferences, and the intoxicating rush of closing a deal. He moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his own worth, possessing a natural fluency in the language of finance and power that Elias found exhausting and utterly foreign. Greg's ambition was not merely to succeed, it was to dominate, to build an empire that would forever cement his name in the annals of Silicon Valley legend. In the early days, this stark contrast was their strength, their own internal synergy. They were the perfect dichotomy. Elias would toil, creating the product that was genuinely disruptive, of revolutionary data compression technology that promised to triple the speed of global communication. Then, Greg would take this beautiful, complex machine and simplify its brilliance into a captivating narrative that captivated venture capitalists and Fortune 500 CEOs alike. Elias was the genius of why, Greg was the master of how much. They met in a university library 15 years prior, two students welded together by a shared ambition and mutual necessity. Elias, living off ramen and working 3 part-time jobs, needed capital and a voice. Greg, born with a silver spoon but hungry for legacy, needed an idea worth selling. They shook hands on a napkin, agreeing to a 50-50 split in perpetuity, an arrangement built on the simple, dangerous trust that fueled all powerful partnerships, the belief that their loyalty to the shared creation transcended any personal desire. The growth of Quantum Leap Solutions was exponential, almost frightening in its velocity. Within 5 years, they were no longer operating out of a cramped garage, but from a sprawling campus. Elias's compression technology was integrated into the operating systems of major telecommunication giants. The money poured in, a torrent so vast it shifted the very landscape of their personal lives. Elias took the minimum necessary, reinvesting everything back into the research and development, seeking the next elegant solution. Greg bought the waterfront mansion, the imported sports cars, and the box seats at every major league game. These differences were not points of friction. They were simply who they were. At least, that is what Elias told himself. But as the company matured and the talk of a massive initial public offering, the IPO became not a dream but a terrifying certainty. The cracks in their foundation began to show. Greg had begun to treat Elias's work not as a sacred creation, but as a reliable tool. He started introducing himself at conferences as the sole visionary, casually referring to Elias as the brilliant head of our R&D wing, a subtle demotion that stripped the engineer of his co-founder status and repositioned him as a talented, but ultimately subordinate, employee. Elias noticed these shifts, of course, but he minimized them. He internalized the slights, filing them away under the label of Greg being Greg, a necessary evil of the spotlight. What truly mattered was the integrity of the code, the purity of the technology. Greg needed the stage. Elias only needed silence and a functioning keyboard. This rationalization, however, was his first crucial mistake. By allowing Greg to control the narrative, he was inadvertently signing away the very narrative of his own life. He was letting the charisma define the worth. One particularly grueling night, 6 weeks before the scheduled IPO roadshow, Elias found himself hunched over his desk, wrestling with a critical security flaw in the latest iteration of their compression algorithm. The entire fate of the company, the hundreds of millions resting on the IPO valuation, hinged on him finding and fixing this single line of compromised code. He felt a sharp, persistent ache blooming in his side, a throbbing pressure that was both demanding and distracting. He rubbed his temples, his vision blurring slightly from the 17 consecutive hours he'd spent in the sterile glow of his monitors. He knew it was stress. It had to be. The relentless, crushing pressure of being the true anchor of a financial juggernaut had been accumulating for years. He had sacrificed his personal life, no marriage, few friends, no hobbies beyond the pursuit of perfect logic for this vision. Now, the body was simply reacting to the extraordinary tax he had placed on it. Greg, by contrast, was in the Cayman Islands, finalizing the tax structure for the IPO bonuses, his voice a jovial, carefree echo on the phone calls. He had dismissed Elias's complaints about the pressure with a breezy wave. Just get it done, buddy. You're the genius. Rest when we're all billionaires. That small dismissal, coupled with the sharp pain he was feeling, should have been a warning. It should have been a red flag waving furiously in the clean air of his office. But Elias was a man who solved problems, not acknowledged weaknesses. He reached for another caffeine pill and swiveled his chair back to the glowing screen, determined to find the solution. The persistent ache was merely an unfortunate cost of the monumental success they were about to achieve. It was just a side effect of creating a billion-dollar company out of thin air. It was just stress. He convinced himself of this, pushing the discomfort deep down beneath the layers of his consciousness, where he hoped it would be consumed by the fire of his work. He had no idea that the silent, internal alarm was not warning him about a flaw in the code, but about a flaw in his own flesh, a quiet, insidious betrayal happening not in the boardroom, but in his own biology. He had prepared for every contingency in the business plan. He had audited every line of their financial forecast, but he was utterly unprepared for the personal contingency that was about to unfold. One that would force him to step away from the keyboard and leave the entirety of his life's work in the hands of the charismatic partner who saw him not as an equal, but as a tool that had finally become disposable. This unseen cost, this physical toll, was about to become the single catalyst for the most devastating, but ultimately empowering, chapter of his existence. The pain he was ignoring was the secret burden he was now carrying, a burden that would soon demand the full, immediate attention that his multimillion-dollar company had never allowed him to give. The human mind is a master of compartmentalization, especially when faced with a truth too terrifying to confront. Elias Vance, the architect of quantum leap solutions, was a man who lived by logic, and his logical conclusion regarding the searing pain that had taken root in his side was that it was simply an unacceptable variable. It was a rogue element introduced by the sheer, ungodly force of success, a side effect of carrying $100 million company on the narrow shelf of his own dedication. He had always possessed the kind of discipline that bordered on the ascetic. His body was merely a vessel for the engine of his intellect, and he treated it with the pragmatic neglect of a mechanic who only services a vehicle when the oil light turns red. But the light was flickering now, not with a gentle warning, but with an angry, persistent pulse, and yet, Elias refused to acknowledge the signal. He was too close. The IPO roadshow was exactly 45 days away. 45 days until the stock ticker bore the symbol of his creation. 45 days until the world ratified the genius he knew lay hidden in the complex architecture of his code. He could not, would not, allow a biological malfunction to derail a decade of absolute sacrifice. The pain, sharp as a sliver of broken glass and deeply rooted, would arrive without warning, typically settling in the quiet, late hours when the office was finally empty and the air conditioning hummed its monotonous lullaby. It wasn't the kind of pain that incapacitated him immediately. It was the insidious kind that demanded his attention, chipping away at the fortress of his concentration, forcing him to shift his weight, to subtly reposition himself in the ergonomic chair he'd bought to maximize efficiency, not comfort. He began to track it, analyzing its frequency and intensity with the same methodical precision he applied to debugging a compromised algorithm. Duration, 2 minutes. Intensity, 7/10 trigger, usually following excessive caffeine or a 3-hour deep focus session. His solution was to increase the dosage of over-the-counter anti-inflammatories and adopt a posture so rigid it resembled a physical suit of armor, designed to hold the agony at bay long enough for him to finish the necessary work. Elias had not built quantum leap solutions for the yachts or the private jets Greg currently enjoyed. He had built it for the immortality of the technology. The IPO was not a payday. It was the final, irreversible validation that his code was not just brilliant, but essential. To admit vulnerability now, to take a step back and deal with a mere physiological inconvenience, felt like an act of profound cowardice, a betrayal of the very work he had dedicated his life to protecting. He recalled a conversation with Greg only a week prior, a fleeting exchange that had cemented his resolution to silence the pain. Greg had called, his voice booming with forced bonhomie, over the crackle of a bad connection from what Elias suspected was a very expensive fishing trip. "How's the final penetration test going?" Greg had asked, the dissonant sound of laughter and clinking ice audible in the background. "There's a small latency issue on the external server handshake. I'm isolating the packet leak," Elias replied, deliberately using complex technical jargon, a subtle defense mechanism against Greg's inevitable simplification. "Right, just, handle it. You're the genius, pal," Greg had chuckled, using the title not as a compliment, but as a casual dismissal of responsibility. "Look, I need you locked down for the next 40. We can't have any glitches when we ring the bell at the NYSE. No distractions. Nothing breaks the flow now. This is our moment. This is our legacy." Legacy. That word, thrown so lightly across thousands of miles of ocean, was what Elias clung to. Greg saw legacy as a bronze statue in a lobby. Elias saw it as the unblemished functionality of his algorithms, running silently and powerfully beneath the surface of the world's communication grid. He couldn't risk the validation of his life's work for a mere, manageable pain. He would endure. He would simply manage the cost until the deal was sealed. The irony was a cold, bitter draft that Elias drank every day, while he physically diminished, struggling to suppress a pain that now kept him up for hours. Greg's public image was expanding, becoming louder, more vibrant, and undeniably more successful. The media narratives surrounding the upcoming IPO were focused entirely on Greg, the handsome face, the dynamic vision, the man who had willed a technology company into existence with sheer force of will. Elias, meanwhile, was the anonymous footnote in the back of the prospectus, the co-founder, who had willingly receded into the shadows of the laboratory. The physical discomfort, which he had initially categorized as a minor system error, began to escalate into a full-scale crisis. It was no longer just a sliver of glass. It was a tight, internal clamp that seemed to be squeezing the very breath out of his lungs. He started losing weight, his tailored work shirts hanging loose on his frame. The scent of coffee, once the fuel of his work, now triggered a low, chronic nausea. Yet, his determination only hardened. The closer they got to the IPO, the more important it became to maintain the illusion of absolute control. Greg's entire contribution was built on the confidence he projected. Elias's entire contribution was built on the seamless reality of the product. If the reality failed, the confidence would shatter, and the IPO would implode. He felt a profound sense of paternal duty to the technology itself. He was its only true protector. The gulf between the partners was widening into an emotional chasm. Greg, basking in the pre-IPO glow, sent Elias a casual shot of himself standing beside a brand-new Ferrari, purchased, he noted in the accompanying text, to celebrate the inevitable. Elias looked at the photograph, the careless, arrogant smile, the unnecessary opulence, and felt a sudden, fierce rush of contempt. It wasn't envy. It was the cold realization that Greg's ambition was purely superficial, driven by the need for external validation, while his own was driven by a genuine, internal pursuit of excellence. This difference in their worth became Elias's new source of energy. He decided that he would endure the physical pain. He would even use it as a quiet, internal monument to his own integrity. The harder the pain pressed, the more clearly it reminded him that he was the one making the real sacrifice, the one paying the true cost for their success. Greg might wear the finest Italian silk, but Elias carried the burden, the secret burden, of the entire company's foundation, both in his mind and, increasingly, in his failing body. One afternoon, a young research assistant, a bright-eyed intern named David, who idolized Elias, walked into the office to drop off a hard drive. He paused, looking at Elias, who was bent over his desk, his face a ghostly gray beneath the fluorescent light. "Mr. Vance, are you all right? You look exhausted." Elias forced a thin, dry smile. "Just the usual pri-po madness, David, the price of creation." He waved his hand dismissively, masking the sharp, agonizing cramp that just shot through his abdomen. "Go enjoy your weekend. I'll be here." The moment David left, Elias gripped the edge of his desk, fighting back a wave of dizzying nausea. His hands were clammy, his temples throbbing. He took a shallow breath, trying to slow the panicked hammering of his own heart. The reality was beginning to supersede the rationale. The pain was no longer manageable. It was asserting dominance. It was demanding to be acknowledged, not as stress, but as a critical, life-faltering fault that threatened to dismantle not just the IPO, but Elias himself. He swallowed 2 more pills, hoping the chemical mask would take hold, but the effort was useless. His body was failing its contract with his mind. The turning point arrived with the slow, terrifying inevitability of a collapsing structure. It was a Monday morning, precisely 5 weeks before the roadshow was scheduled to kick off in New York. Elias was reviewing the final investor deck where Greg's photograph dominated the opening slide. When the pain returned, this time, it was not a cramp or a persistent ache. It was a violent, incapacitating fire that seemed to consume his entire right side. It doubled him over, forcing a guttural gasp from his chest. He stumbled to the floor, collapsing not with a crash, but with a silent, desperate crumple. He lay there, beneath his desk, the fluorescent light of the office casting a harsh, different glow on the ceiling tiles. He tried to speak, to call for the security guard or the cleaning crew, but his throat seized. He was completely, terrifyingly immobilized by the ferocity of the agony. Thought in that moment of absolute physical terror, the facade of his rationale finally shattered. It was no longer about stress or dedication. This was something catastrophic. This was a vulnerability that he could not code around, manage, or suppress with a pill. And the thought that immediately cut through the pain, sharp and terrifying, was not the fear of dying, but the fear of failing the IPO. If he collapsed during the roadshow on the stage, in front of the major institutional investors, during the single most important financial presentation of their corporate history, it would not just postpone the IPO, it would taint the entire company. Greg, the smooth-talking face, would be momentarily embarrassed, but the damage would be attributed to Elias, the eccentric, unstable genius. The media would feast on the instability, and the $100 million valuation would evaporate into smoke. The clarity of that cold, hard logic was like an electric shock. He was not just risking his own health, he was risking the financial immortality of his creation. Lying on the carpet, fighting to drag air into his lungs, Elias made the decision that finally prioritized self-preservation, not for his own sake, but for the company's. He could no longer afford to be a liability. He had to know the truth. Not so he could fix himself for the sake of his life, but so he could implement a contingency plan for the sake of the stock price. With slow, agonizing effort, he crawled back to his desk, grabbing his phone. The fear of what the doctor might say was overwhelming, but the fear of letting Greg's charisma sell flawed goods was greater. He pulled up the contact for his trusted general practitioner, Dr. Reynolds, and with a trembling thumb, pressed the call button. The voice that answered was calm, professional, and utterly oblivious to the collapse of Elias Vance's entire world happening on the floor of his office. "Dr. Reynolds' office, how may I help you?" Elias swallowed the bile rising in his throat. His voice, when it finally emerged, was a strained, painful whisper, barely recognizable as his own. I need an appointment now. It's an emergency, please. It can't wait." The secret burden was finally exposed. He was now on a trajectory that had nothing to do with deadlines or profit margins, but with life and death. He was about to receive the knowledge that would set the stage for the ultimate betrayal, forcing him to surrender the keys to the very person who would seize the moment to destroy him. The moment a man is forced to stop moving, to cease the relentless pursuit of an ambition that has defined his every waking hour, is the moment he finally becomes truly vulnerable. For Elias Vance, the world did not stop with a dramatic crash or a sudden, catastrophic failure of the systems he's held so dear. It stopped with a quiet, mundane wait in a sterile examination room, the kind of silence that amplifies every unspoken dread, the relentless pressure of the approaching IPO, the urgency of the security patch, the very momentum of his $100 million company. All of it came to an abrupt, screeching halt in the unremarkable, lukewarm air of Dr. Reynolds' clinic. He sat on the edge of the paper-covered examination table, the crisp, crinkling sound of the paper beneath his weight, the loudest noise in the universe. The walls were painted a placid, indifferent cream, devoid of the vibrant whiteboard chaos and complex diagrams that were the usual landscape of his mind. Here, his genius meant nothing. His algorithms could not predict the outcome of the blood samples they had just drawn. His financial prowess offered him no immunity. He was simply a patient, waiting for a verdict that transcended the balance sheet. Elias had managed to drag himself out of the office, dismissing the single bewildered security guard with a clip, authoritative command about an urgent off-site consultation. The drive to the clinic had been a haze of suppressed pain and sheer, unadulterated professional impatience. Even now, stripped of his tailored suit jacket and reduced to a cheap hospital gown, his internal monologue was a furious stream of business logistics. I should have sent the final encryption keys before I left. I need to brief Greg on the latency fix. If I'm out for more than 2 days, the roadshow presentation won't be finished. His brain was desperately attempting to impose the ordered logic of the corporate world onto the terrifying anarchy of his own failing body. Dr. Reynolds, a calm, gray-haired man who had been Elias's physician for 15 years, the physician he only ever saw for mandated annual physicals that he consistently tried to reschedule, returned to the room. He did not sit immediately. Instead, he leaned against the counter, folding his hands, his posture radiating a quiet, profound solemnity that immediately chilled Elias to the bone. It was the posture of a judge preparing to deliver a life sentence, not a doctor discussing stress management. Elias, the doctor began, his voice low, measured, and stripped of all casual professional cheer. You were right to come in when you did. The emergency visit was justified. Elias's impatience flared. Good, then what is it? Extreme fatigue, advanced stress-induced gastritis. Give me the prescription, doctor. I have $1 billion company to run, and I need to be back at my desk by this afternoon. The doctor did not smile, did not acknowledge the mention of the $1 billion company or the urgency of the afternoon. He simply held Elias's gaze, and in that silent, prolonged stare, Elias finally felt the full weight of the truth begin to descend. This was not a quick fix. This was not stress. This was fundamentally, irrevocably serious. The fear that had been lurking in the shadows of his professional arrogance finally stepped into the stark light of the examination room. The silence was the loudest, most devastating sound Elias had ever experienced. It stretched, thick and suffocating, between him and the doctor, filled only by the distant clatter of a supply cart down the hallway and the frantic hammering of Elias's own heart against his ribs. It was the silence before the execution, the moment where the entire, complex tapestry of one's life is reduced to a single, brutal thread of information. Dr. Reynolds finally pushed off the counter and took the stool, positioning himself directly opposite Elias, an act of intimate confrontation. He held a clipboard, but his eyes were locked on Elias, conveying the deep, almost personal burden of the news he was about to deliver. Elias, he repeated, I've reviewed your preliminary labs, the CT scan, and the physical examination. Your symptoms, the persistent upper abdominal pain radiating to your back, the sudden, significant weight loss, they pointed to one thing, and the scans unfortunately confirmed it. The doctor paused, drawing a slow, necessary breath. You have a mass. The word mass felt strangely clinical, yet utterly alien. Elias, the man who dealt in binary code and absolute certainty, found his mind utterly incapable of processing the information. He felt a sudden, profound vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. A mass, Elias echoed, the words flat and meaningless. Well, that's not, unusual. They remove it. What's the protocol? We need to schedule the procedure quickly. His voice was still firm, attempting to sound like a CEO dictating a project timeline, but it was edged with a desperate, frantic terror he couldn't hide. Dr. Reynolds shook his head slowly, sadly. Elias, I am going to have you referred to a specialist immediately, an oncologist, but based on the imaging and the tumor markers, we are looking at pancreatic adeno. The full name pancreatic adenocarcinoma landed with the physical force of a demolition ball. It wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a disaster to be endured. Elias's vision tunneled. He didn't hear the subsequent clinical details, the staging, the need for further biopsy, the urgent discussion of aggressive treatment protocols. He only heard the quiet, dreadful finality of the diagnosis. In that single, agonizing moment, the multimillion-dollar IP, the years of work, the fight for the code, Greg's betrayal, the entire empire of Quantum Leap Solutions, collapsed into irrelevance. All of his ambition, his success, his genius, none of it could buy him an extra minute of health. His life, which had been accelerating toward the final, triumphant moment on the stock market floor, had been halted by a single, malignant cell operating outside the laws of his control. He realized, with a horrifying, cold clarity, that he had been so focused on protecting his financial legacy that he had utterly, catastrophically ignored the only legacy that truly mattered: his life. The doctor continued to speak. Words like chemotherapy, surgery, and prognosis floated around the room, but they were muffled and distant, like voices heard from underwater. Elias stared at the framed landscape photo on the wall, a picture of a calm, utterly serene mountain lake. He was no longer thinking about algorithms or stock prices. He was thinking about how little time he had left, and how foolishly he had spent the time he was given. He had dedicated a decade to building a shield for Greg, only to find that he had left his own life defenseless. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was thin, reedy, utterly drained of the authority that had once commanded server rooms and boardrooms. What is the timeline? Dr. Reynolds looked directly at him, his face etched with sympathy. This is highly aggressive, Elias. You need to start treatment immediately. No delays. We will have you admitted for initial staging and planning within 48 hours. You need to clear your calendar entirely. Your focus has to shift 100% to fighting this. Clear his calendar. The phrase felt monstrous. Clear the calendar that held the IPO roadshow, the billion-dollar culmination of his entire existence. But the doctor's words were the absolute truth. There was no negotiating with this diagnosis. There was no coding a work. He could not perform the crucial security patch and undergo aggressive chemotherapy at the same time. He had to choose, and the choice, which would have been impossible just hours before, was now brutally simple. The valuation of Quantum Leap Solutions was meaningless compared to the valuation of his next heartbeat. A cold, grim realization washed over him, a sense of justice that felt terribly misplaced. The very thing he had neglected, his body, was now dictating the terms of his professional defeat. He would have to leave his company, his technology, his life's work, in the hands of the only person he could contact, Greg. The decision was made, not with acceptance, but with the focused, desperate pragmatism of a field commander enacting a disastrous retreat. He had to pull the pin on his work life, secure the assets, and minimize the damage. He couldn't risk the entire company collapsing on the eve of the IPO due to his sudden physical absence. He needed a temporary, highly capable caretaker. He needed to call Greg. Elias slowly pushed himself off the examination table. The sterile paper crinkled one last time, an auditory signal of the end of his old life. He was walking out of this office not as a co-founder, but as a patient with a terrifying secret, and the only thing he carried with him was the awful knowledge that he was about to deliver his most cherished creation, his company, into the hands of the partner he should have never trusted. The fear of the diagnosis was immediate, but the fear of Greg's reaction was the professional reflex that would ultimately set the stage for the catastrophic betrayal to come. He had to tell him. He had to surrender the keys. He reached for his phone, his hand trembling, and prepared to make the call that would change everything. There is a precise moment in every inevitable collapse when the rational mind must choose a point of controlled implosion over the chaos of total failure. For Elias Vance, that moment arrived immediately after the terrible diagnosis, forcing him into the cold, calculated act of surrender. His fear was no longer of the cancer itself, but of the void his sudden absence would create, a vacuum that would instantly swallow the $100 million valuation of Quantum Leap Solutions, jeopardizing his life's work simply because he was unable to stand on the stage for the IPO. He realized he had two critical assets left: the secret of his terminal illness and the control over the company. He could not keep both. To secure the business during his aggressive, immediate treatment, he had to transfer operational control. And that meant telling the only person who could bridge the gap between R&D and Wall Street, Greg Thorne, his brother. Elias did not call Greg from the clinic. He returned to his silent, darkened office, driven by a final, desperate surge of professional duty. He needed the sterile, familiar logic of his workspace to organize the end of his working life. He spent 3 grueling hours, his body screaming in protest, creating 3 distinct, secured packages of information. The first package was for Greg. This contained the immediate operational keys, temporary administrator access to the servers, the schedule for the roadshow, the finalized investor deck, and a brief clinical memo stating that Elias was taking an immediate, indefinite medical leave for an undisclosed, debilitating condition. Crucially, it did not contain the word cancer. Elias knew that news of an aggressive illness would send the stock value plunging faster than a failed security patch. The secret had to be protected for the sake of the IPO. The second package was for his personal lawyer, Mr. Chen, tucked away in a safe deposit box. This contained his original patents, his personal estate planning, and a cryptic, signed document outlining his suspicions about Greg's character, marked with the phrase, "In the event of my permanent incapacitation or death, execute the trust defense protocol immediately." The third package, the most painful, was a handwritten, personal letter to Greg. Elias struggled over every word, his hand trembling not just from weakness, but from the immense weight of the misplaced trust he was about to place in his partner. He addressed Greg not as a colleague, but as the brother he desperately needed him to be. He appealed to their shared history, their napkin-signed agreement, and the dream they had built from nothing. "I am facing something serious, old friend, something that requires me to fight for my life away from the office. I am handing you the keys to the kingdom. Guard it, not for me, but for the legacy we built together. This company is our child. Do not let it fall." It was a desperate plea disguised as a professional handover. Elias knew, deep down, that Greg's ambition was a snake, but he had to believe the history they shared was a strong enough muzzle. He chose hope over data, a flaw that would cost him everything. The most difficult task was the call. Elias waited until 2 a.m., knowing Greg would likely be awake, perhaps closing a late deal, or, more likely, enjoying a luxurious evening. He needed Greg's full, immediate, and sober attention. Greg answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and slightly annoyed. "Elias, do you have any idea what time it is? Is the core server down?" Elias took a slow, deliberate breath, fighting the urge to tell Greg the whole, devastating truth. He chose his words carefully, filtering the terror through the lens of corporate necessity. "Greg, I am facing a major health crisis. It's severe, and it's immediate. I have to step away from the business, effective immediately, for an unknown, but likely extended, period." The silence on the line was not sympathetic, it was calculating. Elias could almost hear the rapid calculation happening in Greg's mind. Absence, indefinite IPO in 5 weeks, opportunity, woe, a health crisis. Greg's tone was engineered concern, professional but shallow. "Look, I'm sorry to hear that, buddy. Is it stress? I told you to relax." "It's not stress. It's debilitating. I am going into a hospital environment shortly. I need you to assume full operational control immediately. I have packed a briefcase for you. It contains everything. Temporary access, the finalized pitch deck, and my medical leave documents. I need you to sign them and file them tomorrow morning." Greg finally shifted gears, his voice taking on the decisive authority Elias expected. Okay, I get it. Emergency mode, don't worry. EU, just focus on getting better. I've got the company, we're family, right? I'll babysit your billion-dollar baby. You just need to sign over the temporary power of attorney for banking and shareholder communications. Saves time, protects the IPO. The casual request for the power of attorney POA was Greg's first, subtle strike. Elias hesitated. He had intended to keep the POA with his lawyer, but Greg's logic was sound. Without it, bank transactions and shareholder approvals related to the IPO would be paralyzed. He needed liquidity and authority to finalize the last steps. Elias was cornered by his own urgency. "It will be limited to financial and operational decisions concerning the IPO, Elias clarified, his voice thin. "Of course, limited," Greg assured him, his voice radiating false sincerity. "It's just administrative. I'll pick up the briefcase at your apartment in an hour. Don't worry about a thing." Hanging up the phone, Elias felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with his diagnosis. He had just delivered the entire foundation of his life's work to the man whose appetite for credit was insatiable. He had protected the stock price by exposing his soul. He had traded security for a lie, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that Greg would exploit every inch of the trust he had just been given. Elias packed the briefcase with the heavy, methodical despair of a man sealing his own tomb. He included the temporary passwords, the access codes for the highly secure server farm, the physical space only Elias and 3 other engineers had ever entered, and a handwritten list of final, critical tasks. He included the temporary POA, a document that represented the absolute surrender of his authority. He stood by his window, watching the city lights blur, feeling the pain intensify, no longer caring about managing it. All that mattered was the looming, unavoidable hospital admission. The isolation was overwhelming. He was facing a life-and-death battle, and the only person he could talk to, the one person he trusted enough to manage his legacy, was the one person who was entirely motivated by the greed he had always minimized. When Greg arrived, it was not in his usual ostentatious sports car, but in an unmarked black SUV, giving the exchange a furtive, almost illicit air. Elias met him in the sterile, brightly lit lobby of his condo building. Greg looked immaculate, radiating energy and authority, the picture of health and success. "Elias," Greg said, moving forward to offer a quick, slightly awkward pat on the shoulder. "Man, you look rough. Get better. Seriously, I'll call you when I'm out of the first investor meetings." Elias handed over the heavy leather briefcase, the symbol of their shared life. He looked directly into Greg's eyes, trying to convey the gravity of the secret he wasn't sharing. "Greg, the technical integrity is everything. Don't let anything disrupt the compression algorithm. And keep this quiet. The severity of my condition cannot be public. Not until after the IPO. Promise me." Greg gripped the briefcase tightly, a possessive, almost predatory look flashing in his eyes that was quickly masked by a practiced, winning smile. "My lips are sealed, Elias. I'll tell everyone you're on a critical, sensitive, top-secret project that only I can manage. Focus on your recovery. The company is safe. Your secret is safe. Your legacy is safe." The words felt like a poison. Your secret is safe. Greg had confirmed the most dangerous dynamic. He knew Elias's secret was the key to the company's stability, and he was now the sole guardian of both. Elias watched Greg's retreating figure, the heavy briefcase held close. He had given the master key of his life's work to a man who had only ever valued what he could extract from a situation. He felt a deep, chilling certainty that he had just signed away more than just the temporary power of attorney. He had just signed away the ability to ever walk back into the life he built. He turned and walked toward the waiting taxi. The only destination now, the stark reality of the hospital. He had protected the company from the external chaos of his illness, but he had left it fatally vulnerable to the internal chaos of his partner's boundless avarice. The true fight, the one for justice, not just life, was just beginning. The silence that descends upon a hospital room is unlike any other. It is a dense, absolute stillness, where the only movement is the slow, deliberate drip of an IV bag, and the only soundtrack is the unsettling rhythm of your own survival. Elias Vance, the quiet genius, who once commanded a billion-dollar company, was now reduced to a simple, struggling patient, his world condensed to the 4 pale walls of a sterile room. And it was in this profound, physical isolation that the slow, chilling realization of his professional abandonment began to set in. He had expected the pain of the chemotherapy to be overwhelming. He had prepared his mind for the inevitable physical degradation, but he was utterly unprepared for the coldness emanating from the world he had sacrificed his life to build. His initial days were a blur of aggressive treatment, invasive tests, and the crushing fatigue that follows the poisoning of one's own system. Through the fog of nausea and exhaustion, the company remained his absolute focus. He had fulfilled his end of the bargain. He had protected the stock price by keeping his terminal diagnosis a secret, and had handed the keys to his trusted partner. Now, he needed Greg to fulfill his. Elias tried to maintain contact. He didn't demand status updates on the IPO. He simply requested confirmation that the critical security patch he had designed hours before his collapse had been properly deployed to the core servers. This was not about power. It was about the technical integrity of his life's work. His first attempt was a text message, sent 48 hours after his admission, a simple, non-alarming query. "Greg, security patch 4.0, must be deployed before the New York meetings. Did you confirm deployment?" The response, when it finally arrived 12 hours later, was jarringly casual. "Relax, buddy. Got it handled. Investors are hungry. Everything is great. Focus on getting better. Got it handled." That phrase, which should have been reassuring, felt dismissive. It lacked the technical confirmation Elias needed. He tried calling later that day. Greg's number went straight to voicemail, which was immediately suspicious. Greg never missed a call. His entire persona was built around being accessible and charismatic. Elias left a calm, authoritative message, detailing the exact protocol for checking the patch deployment. Days bled into a week. Elias called the office not Greg, but his old chief of staff, a loyal, efficient woman named Anya. The conversation was stilted, hesitant. Anya spoke in short, cautious sentences, avoiding any direct references to Greg's actions. She confirmed Greg was now operating with full authority and was very busy preparing for the institutional investor dinners. Elias's sixth sense, intuition that allowed him to spot a single flaw in a million lines of code, was screaming a warning. This wasn't the silence of efficiency. It was the chilling silence of omission. That the complete blackout from Greg was now undeniable. Elias's calls were systematically ignored. His emails, which transitioned from polite inquiries about the security patch to urgent demands for confirmation, were met with automated out-of-office replies or, worse, cryptic non-committal one-liners sent by Greg's personal assistant. Mr. Thorne is currently in a crucial, closed-door strategy session. Elias lay in his hospital bed, his body weak, his mind razor-sharp with dread. He realized that Greg was not merely busy, he was actively evading him. The IPO roadshow was approaching, and Greg had effectively erected a firewall around the company, locking Elias out completely. He managed to get his laptop set up, fighting through the dizziness of his medication. He logged into his professional communication channels, only to find he had been quietly removed from the crucial operational group chats. His access to the shared document archives, the core R&D files, and the critical future development planning had been restricted to This was not carelessness. This was calculated exclusion. Greg was moving to make Elias's input irrelevant. The most profound shock came when Elias managed to access the IPO deck, the highly anticipated final presentation that was to be shown to the major investors. He scrolled through the pages, his heart sinking with every slide. The entire presentation had been radically restructured. The section detailing the future development of the core data compression technology, Elias's brainchild, the most valuable piece of intellectual property they owned, had been dramatically minimized. Where there should have been 10 slides detailing the next-generation architecture and its scalability, there were now only 2, reduced to vague, generalized marketing slogans. Instead, the presentation was overwhelmingly focused on a new initiative, a short-term, high-profit data monetization service that leveraged their existing user base. This service had been Greg's pet project, a shallow, unsustainable revenue stream that Elias had repeatedly argued against because it compromised the long-term vision and diluted the purity of the core technology. Elias stared at the slide detailing the new executive compensation structure. It was bloated, excessive, and placed Greg at the absolute center of every bonus pool and stock option. The text detailing the compression technology, the very soul of the company, was buried in an appendix, almost as an afterthought. The cold reality struck Elias with the force of physical pain, sharper than any tumor. Greg was not just managing the company, he was hijacking it. He wasn't guarding the legacy. He was preparing to sell off the foundation, maximize his personal gain in the immediate IPO, and pivot the company toward his own short-sighted profitable interests. He was systematically cutting out the core tech, the very genius Elias had fought so hard to protect because it was complex, required maintenance, and didn't fit Greg's simple hyperfit sales narrative. Elias, fueled by a renewed icy rage that temporarily eclipsed his physical suffering, knew he had to act. He tried calling his own appointed board seat representative, a venture capitalist named Ms. Davies, a woman he had always considered a solid, rational ally. Ms. Davies' assistant answered, offering a polite but firm wall of evasion. Ms. Davies was in meetings, traveling, unavailable. When Elias finally insisted, identifying himself as the co-founder, the assistant put him on a brief hold and returned with a chilling, pre-programmed response. Mr. Vance, I am instructed to inform you that Mr. Thorne has assumed temporary executive powers under the emergency clauses stipulated in your medical leave. All operational and strategic inquiries must be directed to his office. This wasn't just evasion, this was conspiracy. Greg hadn't just taken control. He had used the medical leave paperwork and the power of attorney POA to manipulate the board into formally recognizing his absolute, unchallenged authority. Elias was not merely absent, he had been legally rendered voiceless. He had believed the board, comprised of seasoned financial veterans, would never allow one partner to ruthlessly sideline the other, especially the one who held the intellectual property. But Greg, the master salesman, had clearly convinced them that Elias's debilitating condition made him a risk, and that only Greg, the charismatic, healthy face, could ensure the IPO's success. The board, seeing the imminent millions, chose stability and profitability over loyalty and ethics. Lying there, weak and betrayed, Elias connected the dots. The restricted access, the ignored calls, the restructuring of the IPO deck, the silence from the board, it all painted a single, horrifying picture. Greg had seized the moment of Elias's maximum vulnerability to execute a corporate coup. He had not just stolen the company, he was preparing to dismantle Elias's life's work for short-term gain, using the very secret Elias had entrusted him with as the final, absolute weapon. A cold, determined resolve began to replace the fear in Elias's chest. He was dying, yes, but he was also the victim of a calculated, massive betrayal. He was powerless to stop the chemotherapy, but he was absolutely unwilling to allow Greg to destroy his creation. He had protected the company from the external threat. Now he had to figure out how to protect it from the internal monster he had just unleashed. The silent betrayal from the boardroom had given Elias something more potent than health, purpose. He knew now that his fight was no longer just against the cancer. It was against the ruthless avarice of the man he had once called his brother. The time for pleading was over. The time for justice, however weak his body might be, had begun. He closed his eyes and started formulating the counterattack, realizing his most dangerous enemy was already wearing the company badge. The sting of betrayal is not the loss of money, but the calculated, surgical destruction of dignity. For weeks, Elias had endured the chilling silence, the restricted access, and the horrifying realization that his company was being hijacked. But nothing prepared him for the moment when the formal, legal documentation of his expulsion arrived. It was not a tense showdown in the boardroom, nor a hostile negotiation with lawyers. It was a simple, sealed manila envelope delivered by a grim-faced courier to his hospital bedside, arriving just hours after his second round of chemotherapy. Inside the envelope, printed on the heavy, embossed paper of Quantum Leap Solutions, were the minutes of an emergency board meeting. The date listed was 3 days prior. The board, acting under the broad emergency powers granted by the temporary power of attorney that Greg had so casually requested, had formally invoked the founder incapacitation clause. This clause, an obscure but necessary addition, drafted years ago to protect the company from external crises, was now being wielded as a weapon from within. The text was bureaucratic, precise, and utterly ruthless. Elias Vance, co-founder and chief technology officer, was declared permanently unable to fulfill the fiduciary responsibilities of his role due to his indefinite, debilitating health crisis. He was immediately removed from the board of directors. His 50% equity share, the share that represented every late night, every line of code, every sacrifice of his personal life, was to be repurchased by the company at a fraction of its pre-IPO valuation. The official repurchase price was a sickening, insulting figure, a valuation based on a private pre-series of funding round from 5 years prior. This was not the calculation of a legal team, it was the arithmetic of malice. Greg and the board, desperate to clear their balance sheet of Elias's massive ownership stake before the IPO, were stripping him of his life's work for an amount that, while still significant, amounted to a mere pittance compared to the hundreds of millions he was truly owed. The IPO would launch, Greg would become a billionaire, and Elias would be left with a fraction of his original investment, silenced and legally excised from the company he created. The cold audacity of the maneuver stunned Elias into a paralysis more profound than his illness. This wasn't merely greed. This was a calculated, premeditated theft executed with the formal, antiseptic blessing of corporate law. Greg hadn't just used the power of attorney. He had used Elias's very diagnosis, the secret he had sworn to protect, as the final, absolute justification for the steal. The indignity of the removal was matched only by the isolation of his position. Elias was confined to a hospital room, his immune system compromised, utterly unable to physically appear and challenge the vote. He was fighting a biological war for his life. while Greg was waging a legal war for his fortune, and Greg had the undeniable advantage of presence. He was there, healthy, charming, and persuasive, weaving a narrative of Elias as the unstable, ungrateful, and inconvenient liability. Elias called Anya, his former chief of staff, her number dialed with a cold, focused fury that made his hands tremble. Anya answered, her voice tight, brittle with tension. Anya, the board minutes. Did they genuinely vote me out based on the incapacitation clause? I gave Greg a temporary medical leave, not an indefinite retirement. Anya whispered, her voice barely audible over the phone. Elias, I can't talk long. Yes. Greg presented documentation, the temporary POA, the medical leave form you signed, and a letter from an external consultant claiming your condition presented a material risk to shareholder confidence. He framed it as a necessary measure to stabilize the company for the IPO. The vote was unanimous. Unanimous. The word resonated with the hollowness of ultimate betrayal. Not a single director, not one person he had spent years working beside, had stood up to challenge Greg's ruthless narrative. They had looked at a sick man's life savings and unanimously voted to take it, prioritizing the certainty of the immediate IPO profit over any vestige of moral integrity. And the repurchase price? Elias asked, his voice low, dangerously controlled. That valuation is fraudulent. It's based on an outdated term sheet. It's a blatant breach of fiduciary duty. Greg claimed he was protecting the company's liquidity, Anya explained, rushing her words. He argued that buying back your shares at a lower pre-dilution rate was necessary to ensure the cash reserves for the new data monetization push. He tied it all back to the new business model. Elias, he had a legal team ready. It was planned. He told everyone you had gone rogue and were threatening to sabotage the IPO if your demands for R&D funding weren't met. The lie was brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. Greg hadn't just fired him, he had defamed him, painting Elias as the irrational antagonist and himself as the heroic savior stabilizing the ship. Elias now understood the full extent of Greg's avowal. It wasn't just about controlling the company, it was about erasing Elias's very contribution, reducing him to a bitter, forgotten footnote. The physical pain was overwhelming, but the intellectual shock of the betrayal was a cold, pure antidote to the delirium of his illness. Elias lay back against the pillows, the formal removal documents scattered across his chest like grave offerings. The fear was gone, replaced by a steely, focused determination that brought a terrifying clarity to his mind. He was officially out. He was irrelevant. His equity was stolen. His creation was being dismantled. He had nothing left to lose, and in that vacuum of loss, a new, terrible purpose was born. His fight for life was now inextricably linked to a fight for justice. He had believed, incorrectly, that the highest achievement was building the code. He now realized the highest achievement was survival, for the express purpose of vengeance. He would not just fight the cancer. He would fight Greg Thorne until the man's carefully constructed empire crumbled into dust. His mind, the genius intellect that had built quantum leap solutions, began working immediately, no longer on algorithms of compression, but on algorithms of destruction. Greg stole the company through the incapacitation clause. Greg stole the valuation by claiming liquidity issues. Greg stole the narrative by claiming Elias was a financial threat. Elias saw the flaws in Greg's coup. Greg had stolen the present, but he had failed to steal the past, the intellectual property that formed the very foundation of the company's existence. The repurchase agreement only covered Elias's shares. It did not explicitly nullify his personal ownership of the original patents developed before the company's final formation, the assets he had carefully placed in an outside trust years ago. It was a minuscule, obscure legal detail that Greg Tay, in his haste for immediate money and power, had overlooked. The time for grieving the betrayal was over. The time for legal action was beginning. He had one remaining ally, Mr. Chen, his personal lawyer, who held the sealed letter and the keys to his true assets. Elias reached for his phone, the weight of the handset feeling immense in his weakened grasp. He needed to make a call that would not involve medical symptoms or stock prices, but the meticulous, cold-blooded planning of a new Campania rival that would use his original, protected patents to launch a direct, devastating challenge to the very foundation Greg now stood upon. The deepest pit of vulnerability is not when you are fighting the sickness, but when you are forced to confront the sickness of the human heart while your body is already in ruin. Elias had just endured a grueling, week-long regimen of radiation and chemotherapy. leaving him utterly depleted, his mind a slow, fog-ridden landscape, and his limbs heavy with weakness. He was in the precise, profound state of incapacitation that Greg Thorne had so ruthlessly exploited to remove him from the company. It was at this moment of absolute physical defeat that Greg chose to deliver the final, devastating blow. The visit was not spontaneous, it was calculated. Greg arrived at Elias's isolated room not during the brief, strictly regulated visiting hours, but during a lull in treatment, slipping past the nurse's station with the smooth, practiced charm of a man who belonged everywhere. He did not bring flowers or a word of genuine comfort. He brought a heavy leather briefcase and the sterile, unsettling odor of expensive colantha, scent of the boardroom carried into the sick room. "Elias, buddy, how are you feeling?" Greg's voice was warm, loud, and utterly insincere. It was the voice he used for closing minor sales, a voice Elias recognized as a prelude to manipulation. He sat down abruptly in the visitor's chair, crossing his legs, his posture radiating aggressive health and impatient energy. Elias tried to sit up, but the movement cost him a grunt of pain. He was unable to move quickly, unable to speak with the authoritative clarity he desperately needed. His weakness was Greg's ultimate weapon. "I am stable," Elias managed, his voice thin and cracked. "Greg, I need to talk about the repurchase. It's fraudulent. You cannot value the company on a 5-year-old term sheet. It's a breach of fiduciary duty and corporate ethics." Greg waved a dismissive hand, the gesture sweeping away a decade of shared creation. "Ethics, Elias. Look at you." The board was unanimous. "You were creating an unacceptable liability for the IPO. They had to stabilize." "We're not talking about ethics right now. We're talking about legal certainty. And honestly, the board is tired of your drama." He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick stack of documents, the hospital bed contract. It was a massive, intimidating volume of legal language, its appearance alone designed to overwhelm a sick man's ability to focus. Greg placed the documents directly on the edge of the bed, dangerously close to Elias's IV drip. "This is the final termination and buyout agreement. It finalizes the repurchase of your shares at the agreed-upon rate, cleans up all the messy legal entanglements, and gives you a generous severance package." Elias frowned, forcing his mind to focus through the chemically induced fog. "I haven't agreed to the rate. I haven't even had independent counsel review the repurchase terms." "That's exactly why I'm here," Greg pressed, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Look, I'm cutting out the lawyers and the drama. I'm doing this as your friend. I know the valuation is rough, but there's a massive problem the board doesn't know about yet. If you fight this, if you demand a higher valuation, you force a lawsuit. That lawsuit will make your terminal illness public record." Greg paused, letting the implication land with devastating force. If the market gets a whiff that the co-founder who built the entire technology is dying of pancreatic cancer a week before the IPO, the stock price doesn't just dip, it crashes. The IPO is killed, not just for us, but for all the institutional investors who believed in me. We lose everything, Elias, and they will come after you for market manipulation. This was the core of Greg's genius, weaponizing Elias's own integrity. He knew Elias would sacrifice his entire fortune to protect the company and the idea from public scandal. He was forcing Elias to choose between financial self-preservation and the complete, catastrophic annihilation of the company he created. "If you sign this, right now," Greg continued, producing a sleek, expensive pen, "we finalize the purchase, you get your severance, and your money is guaranteed. You disappear quietly. You focus on your health, and the company survives. I get to ring the bell on the New York Stock Exchange, and your work, your algorithms, will continue to change the world. You protect your legacy." Elias realized the true genius of the final agreement. It wasn't just a buyout, it was a comprehensive gag order and non-disparagement clause, buried deep within the legal jargon. By signing, Elias would not only finalize the theft of his equity, but he would also legally bar himself from ever speaking out against Greg, the board, or the fraudulent terms, effectively silencing him for life. He was being forced to sign his own legal execution. Elias closed his eyes, summoning every ounce of his failing strength, his mind searching for an opening, a vulnerability in the airtight legal trap. He felt a profound, cold fury not just at Greg, but at the entire system that allowed power to prey on the weak. He slowly reached out a trembling hand and picked up the thick contract. He ignored the highlighted signature lines and, fighting the overwhelming urge to sleep, forced his eyes to scan the fine print. He knew that if Greg was so eager to bypass the lawyers, there might be a crucial, small oversight. He didn't read the paragraphs detailing the equity price or the severance. He went straight to the archaic, complex sections regarding intellectual property release and patent assignment. Greg, seeing Elias's eyes glaze over the dense legal text, chuckled, misinterpreting the focused reading for fatigue. Don't bother, my lawyers made sure it's airtight. It releases all claims on the company, Elias whispered, still scanning, ignoring Greg. Yes, but what about pre-formation IP? The patents filed before the Series A incorporation, are they explicitly listed? There was a flicker of something in Greg's eyes, a momentary hesitation, quickly replaced by smooth confidence. Of course, they're covered. It says all intellectual property created during the formation of quantum leap solutions. But Elias had spotted the flaw. In his desperate rush to secure the current market value and steal the equity, Greg's legal team had used standard corporate boilerplate that assigned all subsequent IP to the company. They had failed to specifically list the original 3 core patents, true heart of the compression technology, which Elias had filed years before the company's formal structuring and had placed into a separate, obscurely named technology holding trust during the Series A funding. Greg, who had only ever cared about the sales pitch, had never understood the distinction. He had only seen the company, not the foundation. That this small, brilliant piece of foresight, executed years ago by the genius engineer who protected his code before his wallet, was the only remaining weapon he possessed. Elias put the contract down, picking up the pen. He looked Greg directly in the eye, his gaze cold, devoid of warmth or forgiveness. He was signing his death warrant, but he was also preserving the seeds of his vengeance. I need your word, Greg, Elias said, his voice flat. You protect the technology. You don't abandon the core compression research for that shallow monetization scheme. I promise. Elias, I'll make you proud, Greg lied, his smile wide and victorious. With a final, terrible surge of strength, Elias signed the document with a shaky but legible hand. The pressure released. He had sealed his fate and lost his fortune. But he had legally preserved the original 3 patents. Greg scooped up the signed contract, beaming, and checked his expensive watch. Great, well, I have to run. Big investor dinner tonight. Get well, old friend. You're finally free of the burden. Elias watched Greg stride out of the room, leaving behind the chilling scent of his ambition. He was stripped, silenced, and betrayed, but he was not yet defeated. He had saved the only weapon he needed. His next move would not be to fight the cancer, but to call the lawyer who knew the legal difference between a company and its true creation. The time for survival was over. The time for justice, armed with a hidden legal detail, was now. The ultimate act of self-determination is not the building of a fortune, but the precise, surgical decision of how that fortune or the remnants of it will be used after betrayal. Elias Vance had just signed a contract that stripped him of his company, his dignity, and most of his financial future, but he had preserved the single, most critical weapon, the legal integrity of his original patents. Lying in his hospital bed, his body devastated by treatment, he reached for the phone not to call a doctor, but to call the only person who understood the cold, complex architecture of corporate power better than Greg Thorne, Veronica Hayes. Veronica was a legend in the venture capital world, a corporate mentor who had served as Elias's external advisor during the very earliest, most desperate days of Quantum Leap Solutions. She had the steel spine of a seasoned negotiator and the strategic mind of a chess grandmaster. She was the one who had insisted, years ago, that Elias separates his original IP from the company's incorporation for maximum security. The advice that now formed the single fault line in Greg's conquest. Elias dialed her private, unlisted number, the handset feeling impossibly heavy in his grasp. The fear of death had been replaced by a singular, blinding focus on justice. Veronica answered, with her customary brisk, no-nonsense efficiency. Elias, what is it? You never call this line unless the sec is knocking. Elias struggled to control the weakness in his voice, injecting a cold, authoritative clarity into his tone. Veronica, I need your help. It's worse than the SEC. It's Greg. He invoked the incapacitation clause and bought out my equity for a pittance. He has cut out the core technology from the IPO deck. I am being poisoned, Veronica, both by the chemo and by the man I once called my brother. He laid out the bare facts with the methodical precision of an engineer describing a system failure: the terminal diagnosis, the secret, the power of attorney, the unanimous board vote, and the fraudulent equity repurchase. He emphasized the sheer, calculated brutality of the hospital bed contract he had been forced to sign. Veronica listened without interruption, the only sound on her end a faint, sharp intake of breath. When Elias finished, the silence was heavy, charged with intellectual fury. "That absolute snake," Veronica finally hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "He used your loyalty as a shield for his greed." "Elias, what is the status of the 3 core patents, the ones filed under the Delta Trust before the Series A?" Elias felt a fierce spike of validation. "They are secure. The buyout agreement only covers subsequent IP assigned to the company. The original patents were not explicitly listed as transferred." Veronica's response was a swift, strategic command, not an offering of sympathy. "Could that oversight is Greg's funeral. That small technicality is the $100 million weapon he left on the table. But we have no time. What is your health prognosis?" "Aggressive treatment is mandatory." "I'm fighting for time. A few months, maybe longer, if the treatment stabilizes. We cannot wait for the IPO to finalize. Greg is too close to cashing out." Veronica understood the assignment perfectly. This was not a rescue mission. It was a scorched earth campaign, a fight to destabilize Greg's empire from the outside, using the very intellectual property he believed he had eliminated. She arrived at the hospital 2 days later, not in the drab suits of a corporate lawyer, but dressed in civilian clothes, slipping in and out unnoticed, blending into the routine of the hospital. She brought no flowers, but she brought a pristine, unmarked ledger and a digital notary. She looked at Elias Bell, weak, but with the cold, focused fire back in his eyes, and her respect for him deepened. "We have 2 immediate, parallel tasks, Elias," Veronica stated, opening the ledger. "First, the new will. You need to assume that Greg's actions might destroy your financial stability completely. We need to legally protect the assets you have left and prevent Greg from ever touching a single dime of the money he forced you to take. We are going to rewrite your will to make absolute certain sure that Greg Thorne receives nothing, not a memory, not a single penny." She began to dictate, her words sharp and decisive, carving out a new destiny for the remnants of Elias's fortune. All remaining financial assets, his apartment, and the small pension he had accumulated were directed into a neuro research and cancer support foundation, named after his late mother. It was a strategic move, diverting his money into a public, charitable entity that Greg could never access or claim, ensuring his final wealth served a greater purpose than his partner's pocket. Second, we are going to establish a new company, a holding entity that exists solely to leverage your Delta Trust patents. We need to prove that Quantum Leap Solutions is built on a stolen, fundamentally vulnerable foundation. We will use your original patents, the real, undisputed intellectual core, to develop a faster, more elegant successor to the technology Greg now controls." Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, his mind leaping into the familiar, exhilarating rush of creation. A rival, a phantom company that uses superior technology to undermine the core asset he's taking public. "Exactly," Veronica confirmed, nodding. "We are going to create a superior product, announce its existence publicly, and effectively tell the institutional investors that the billion-dollar company they are about to buy is running on obsolete, non-exclusive technology. We will turn Greg's victory into a liability." The work became Elias's new, desperate form of therapy. He stopped dwelling on the nausea and the pain, and focused solely on the cold, beautiful logic of reconstruction. He was too weak to code, but he could design, architect, and strategize. He and Veronica spent hours in that small, quiet hospital room, transforming it into a clandestine headquarters for vengeance. Elias drafted the technical specifications for the new product, codenamed Exodus, a next-generation compression platform that rendered Quantum Leap's current model instantly obsolete. He directed Veronica to use a small portion of his remaining personal funds to hire 3 trusted former engineering colleagues, geniuses who had been sidelined by Greg's sales-focused regime, working remotely. Unaware of Elias's true condition, he was rebuilding his team from the ashes, dedicated to a single goal: creating the perfect rival. The new will was finalized and notarized. Right there in the hospital room, a solemn, definitive statement of his refusal to allow Greg to profit from his death. He legally assigned the Exodus project and the Delta Trust patents to the newly formed foundation, ensuring that the technology would serve humanity and never Greg's avarice. Veronica looked at the signed documents, the new will, the foundation charter, the technical specifications for Exodus, all created while Elias was fighting for his life. You are stripped of your company, Elias, but you have just weaponized your mind. You have created a legal and technical fortress that Greg cannot breach. Elias gripped the cold aluminum of his The Fourth Pole, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. Greg wanted me gone. He thought a sick man was harmless. He didn't realize that in stealing my equity, he freed me from the restrictions of being a partner. I am no longer bound by fiduciary duty to Quantum Leap Solutions. I am free to build its immediate, devastating replacement. He was still in the hospital, his life hanging by a thread, but the purpose had returned. The original patents, the new will, and the new ally had coalesced into a perfect counterplan. He was ready to stop surviving and start fighting. His next step was to secure the physical space and the operational capital, to turn the blueprints of vengeance into a reality. There is a terrible, magnificent beauty in hitting absolute zero, the point where you have lost everything and are therefore free to risk it all. Elias Vance, stripped of his title, his equity, and his health, emerged from the hospital, not into recovery, but into a war room. He had salvaged his intellect and his legal rights to the original compression patents. Now, he had to take the small, insulting financial settlement Greg had forced upon him and turn it into the capital for a devastating counterstrike. The primary directive was absolute secrecy. Greg Thorne, preparing for the triumphant IPO, would have spies watching every high-profile move Elias made. Therefore, the new company could not announce its presence. It had to be a ghost. Elias tasked Veronica Hayes with executing the strategic launch, insisting on 3 non-negotiable rules for the new entity, codenamed Exodus: invisible funding. All capital expenditures were to be routed through a complex web of shell corporations and the newly established Neuro Research Foundation, ensuring Greg could never trace the source of the startup funding back to Elias's settlement. Remote command. Elias would never set foot in the physical office space. His command center remained his small, temporary apartment, where he coordinated the technical design via encrypted channels. Untraceable talent. The engineering team had to be comprised of people who despised Greg's sales-driven regime, but who were currently irrelevant to the tech world. Veronica secured a bland, anonymous office space in a satellite city 2 hours from Quantum Leap's headquarters. It was a space designed for obscurity, not glamour, located next to a tax preparation service and a dry cleaner. This was the quiet, unassuming birthplace of a billion-dollar rival. Elias had already contacted his key personnel. The first was Dr. Lena Costa, a brilliant data scientist Greg had fired for being too obsessed with theoretical purity. The second was Marcus McAllen, a security architect who had left Quantum Leap in disgust after Greg started cutting corners on core defense protocols. They were both genius engineers, and both shared Elias's burning contempt for Greg's superficial management style. He met them individually, using temporary burner phones and meeting in silent, dimly lit diners far from the city. He didn't offer them stock options or excessive salaries. He offered them vengeance. Greg is dismantling our core technology to fund a short-term cash grab, Elias told Lena, his voice low and intense. He thinks the original patents are worthless. I need you to prove him wrong. I need you to take the Exodus architecture I designed and built the future he ignored. Are you in? Lena's reply was simple, cold, and immediate. Greg Thorne stole the soul of that company. I will help you bury him. The new company, Exodus, was built on an ethos of brutal efficiency and pure, unadulterated innovation, the very principles Elias had established at Quantum Leap before Greg corrupted them. The small team, Elias as the unseen architect, Lena leading the software development, and Mac building the security framework, worked in a state of absolute, feverish focus. Elias, despite his continuous, exhausting rounds of treatment, found a potent, paradoxical energy in the work. The chemotherapy weakened his body, but the purpose sharpened his mind. He was coding and designing with a focused clarity he hadn't possessed, even during the height of Quantum Leap's success. He was no longer motivated by the pursuit of wealth, but by the relentless pursuit of perfection. the drive to create something so superior, so undeniably elegant, that it would expose Greg's cheap, monetized business model as the fraud it was. The core of Exodus was built entirely around Elias's secured Delta Trust patents, using them as the legal and technical foundation to leapfrog Quantum Leap's outdated system. While Greg was focused on selling a higher-risk data monetization service, Elias was focused on creating the next technological revolution, a proprietary quantum-safe compression protocol that promised data transfer security and speed that defied industry standards. The challenge was capital. Elias's settlement was only a fraction of the funding required for a true tech launch. Veronica, however, had structured the financing brilliantly. She approached small, ethical, family-run venture funds who were interested in the technology itself, not the market hype. She presented the patents under a completely opaque holding name, omitting any mention of Elias Vance or Quantum Leap Solutions, selling the product on its merit alone. She raised just enough seed money to keep the engineers paid and the servers running, maintaining the company's ghost status. Meanwhile, Greg Thorne was oblivious. He was too busy flying first class, hosting lavish investor dinners, and finalizing the pre-IPO valuation. He assumed Elias was dying quietly, a legally silenced ghost. Greg's final message to Elias's locked-out email account had confirmed his total delusion. Enjoy the quiet, the big money is just ahead. Thanks for clearing the runway for me. Greg saw an open runway. Elias was building a missile in the hangar next door. 6 months passed, 6 months of grueling physical decline for Elias, matched by a relentless, exponential technological ascent for Exodus. The contrast was devastating. Elias now relied heavily on his medications, his public appearances restricted, his contact with the outside world channeled exclusively through Veronica and his small, devoted team. Yet, the work he commanded from his quiet apartment was earth-shattering. The Exodus platform was ready. It was faster, cleaner, and legally insulated by the Delta Trust patents. It was the perfect technical weapon designed to target the single most vulnerable part of Greg's operation, the investor. Confidence in the technology itself. The goal was no longer to make a profit. It was to inject chaos and doubt into Greg's IPO narrative. They needed to move from a ghost company to a phantom threat, a rumor that carried the weight of undeniable technical superiority. Elias, his voice now weak but his commands perfectly precise, gave Veronica the final directive. We will not launch a sales campaign. We will launch a demonstration. Veronica organized a highly exclusive, invite-only, anonymous symposium focused on next-generation data integrity. The guest list was meticulously curated. Only the chief technology officers, CTOs, and lead engineers from the top 10 telecommunications firms, the very clients whose ongoing business Greg was relying on to sustain his IPO valuation. Elias, too weak to attend, delivered the keynote address via a heavily secured, anonymous video stream. He presented the Exodus protocol, detailing the quantum-safe compression protocol with the brilliant, undeniable clarity of his genius. He presented the technical data, the benchmarks, and the flawless security architecture. He never mentioned Quantum Leap, Greg, or the Betrayal. He didn't have to. The demonstration was a map. The CTOs understood instantly. The technology Greg was about to take public was already obsolete. The core product, the foundation of Quantum Leap's billions, was now legally and technically inferior to a mysterious, anonymous rival that had appeared out of nowhere. The IPO date loomed large, just 3 weeks away. Elias had taken his last piece of capital, his last surge of physical energy, and the ultimate brilliance of his mind, and forged a sword of pure innovation. He was ready to stop building and start striking. The phoenix had risen, and its shadow was about to fall across Greg Thorne's triumphant final moments. The ultimate weapon in the corporate world is not money. It is information, delivered at the precise moment it causes maximum damage. Elias Vance knew that he didn't need to defeat Greg Thorne in court, or even in the stock market. He simply needed to inject enough technical doubt into the system that Greg's entire, brittle financial narrative would collapse under its own weight. The anonymous symposium, hosted by the phantom company Exodus, was the perfect detonator. Within 48 hours of the secret demonstration, the tremors began. The whispers started not on the trading floor, but in the exclusive, closed-door meetings of the global telecommunications elite, the very industry that formed the backbone of Quantum Leap Solutions' customer base. lead engineers and chief technology officers, the individuals who understood the cold, hard reality of data processing, were exchanging highly secured, cryptic messages about an unlicensed, impossible protocol that rendered current compression standards instantly obsolete. They had seen the anonymous presentation of Exodus and its quantum-safe protocol, and the technical benchmarks were beyond dispute. The speed, the security, and the efficiency were flawless. Elias, operating from his quiet, isolated apartment, monitored the fallout through Veronica Hayes. Veronica, with her deep connections to the corporate world, was receiving panicked, indirect inquiries from executives. They weren't asking what the new technology was. They were asking who owned the patents. The fear is palpable. Elias, Veronica reported during one of their encrypted calls, the big players are terrified. They spent billions integrating Quantum Leap's existing technology. If a rival has a superior, more secure platform, they face a massive, immediate technological overhaul. They are looking at billions in unforeseen capital expenditure, all because of an anonymous video stream. Elias, weak but satisfied, gave his next command. We do not confirm ownership. We do not announce a launch. We simply confirm the patents are secure and non-exclusive to any single market entity. We want Greg to feel the pressure, not from us, but from his own customers. The result was immediate destabilization. Greg's sales teams, trying to finalize massive pre-IPO contracts with the telco giants, were suddenly meeting unexpected resistance. Executives who had been ready to sign multi-year agreements were now demanding technical assurances regarding future platform security and asking pointed questions about the potential for disruptive external IP. They were trying to protect themselves from the phantom threat. Greg Thorne, consumed by the superficial demands of the IPO roadshow, initially dismissed the technical whispers as few. He was too busy being the visionary, focused on charming institutional investors with his shallow data monetization scheme. He relied on the sheer momentum of the hype machine to overcome any resistance. He had successfully convinced the board that Elias's original core technology was merely the foundation, and that the new revenue streams were the future. However, the pressure intensified when a major European telecommunications conglomerate, a key Quantum Leap client, abruptly paused their final, multi-million-dollar contract. The email sent to Greg's office was cold and brief, citing unacceptable fiduciary risk stemming from a newly identified potential vulnerability in core compression IP. Greg, finally rattled, stormed into the company's R&D wing, the wing Elias had created, and demanded answers from Lena Costa and Mac Allen, the very engineers secretly building Exodus. What is this nonsense about vulnerability? Greg roared, oblivious to the fact that he was yelling at the architect of his demise. Is there a security flaw? I need to tell the market we are fully secure. Lena, perfectly coached by Elias, maintained her cool. The core algorithm is stable, Greg, but security isn't static. There are rumors of a new, quantum-safe protocol hitting the market. If our competitors license it, our system becomes obsolete. It's an intellectual property vulnerability, not a security flaw. We've been trying to budget R&D to address this, but all our budget was diverted to the monetization service. Greg, in his boundless arrogance, dismissed the threat of superior technology in favor of his financial narrative. Rumors, you think a few tech blogs are going to derail a billion-dollar IP? Focus on what matters, Lena. The monetization service, that's the future. Stop worrying about dead code. His ignorance was lethal. He refused to recognize the technical threat because he didn't understand technology. He only understood sales. He believed he could talk his way out of any problem. He failed to realize that the phantom threat was real, and it was using his own neglect as ammunition. The Exodus team, under Elias's quiet command, moved to the next phase. A targeted, public release of non-proprietary technical white papers, all published under anonymous academic pseudonyms. These papers didn't mention the Exodus name, but they detailed the mathematical principles behind the quantum-safe compression protocol. This was the ultimate form of market pressure. By revealing the science, Elias forced the entire tech industry to acknowledge that the benchmark for data compression had fundamentally shifted. Institutional investors, driven by their own due diligence, began to raise sharp, aggressive questions. The market suddenly realized the IPO valuation of Quantum Leap Solutions was based on a technological premise that was mathematically outdated. The core asset Greg was selling was rapidly depreciating in real time. The final, devastating blow came from a highly respected financial journalist, known for his corporate honesty, who published a single, highly circulated opinion piece just 10 days before the IPO. The looming question for Quantum Leap is not whether their monetization strategy will succeed, but whether their core technology is still exclusive. If recent academic papers are true, the company is attempting to go public on the strength of a technology that is not only inferior but may already be circumvented by external, non-licensed IP. Investors are not buying an innovative future, they are buying an obsolete past. Panic began to ripple through the financial markets. The stock underwriters, who rely on market confidence, started making nervous calls to Greg, demanding definitive legal proof that Quantum Leap's IP was secure and cutting-edge. The easy charisma Greg had relied on was dissolving under the weight of hard technical reality. Elias, watching the financial dominoes begin to fall from the quiet sanctuary of his apartment, felt a grim satisfaction. He was still weak, still undergoing treatment, but his mind had found its perfect vengeance. He had built a rival that wasn't about money, it was about truth. He had forced the market to recognize that the true value of Quantum Leap solutions lay not in Greg's sales pitch, but in the patents Greg had negligently allowed to slip through his grasp. The company was now deeply vulnerable, poisoned from the outside by the superior intellect of the man Greg had tried to bury. The scene was set for the climactic confrontation. The speed at which an empire falls is often dictated by the fragility of its foundation, and the foundation Greg Thorne stood upon was cracking under the weight of his own lies. The anonymous technical papers, the whispers of the Exodus Protocol, and the sudden cessation of large client contracts had plunged Quantum Leap Solutions into a state of panic just days before the scheduled IPO. The market was asking the questions Greg couldn't answer, and the underwriters, the powerful firms responsible for selling the stock, were threatening to pull the offering entirely. The final, devastating domino fell when the European telecommunications giant, which had paused its contract, formally terminated the deal, citing unmitigated IP risk. This act sent a shockwave through the financial world, turning Greg's pre-IPO triumph into a public relations catastrophe. Greg, frantic and cornered, saw his billion-dollar empire dissolving around him. He could no longer rely on charisma. He needed a technical defense. He called an emergency, last-minute board of directors meeting, a desperate attempt to reassure the directors and the lead underwriters that the company's intellectual property was secure and that the technical rumors were baseless. Elias Vance, lying in his quiet apartment, received the news of the emergency meeting from Veronica Hayes, who had used her deep financial connections to secure a listening ear on the inside. The time for subtlety was over. The time for the direct, surgical strike had arrived. He's panicking. Elias, Veronica confirmed over a secure line. He's blaming the R&D team for incompetence and trying to push the IPO date through, hoping momentum will save him. We have him exactly where we want him. We move now, Elias commanded, his voice weak from treatment but sharp with cold resolve. The goal is not to stop the IP, it is to prove the IP is worthless before the bell rings. Greg believes his legal counsel secured everything. He has forgotten the Delta Trust. Veronica's appearance at the emergency board meeting was calculated to cause maximum psychological and legal damage. She arrived unannounced, walking into the tense, airless room, filled with nervous directors and grim-faced underwriters. She did not represent Elias as a claimant seeking justice. She represented the Delta Trust, the legal entity holding the original, pre-formation patents that were the true, essential core of Quantum Leap's functionality. Greg, seated at the head of the polished mahogany table, his face, drawn and pale, exploded when he saw her. Veronica, what is the meaning of this? This is a private corporate meeting. You have no standing here. Veronica Tom, impeccably dressed and radiating authorities, imply placed a thick legal binder on the table, turning to a specific, marked page. On the contrary, Mr. Thorne, I am here to inform the board, the underwriters, and the institutional investors present that the foundation of this company's valuation, its core data compression protocol, is currently infringing on intellectual property held by the Delta Trust. The room erupted in a chaotic mix of shouts and nervous demands. Greg, pale with fury, tried to seize control. That's absurd. That technology belongs to Quantum Leap. Elias signed away all rights. Veronica didn't engage with him. She spoke directly to the board chair, her voice cutting through the noise. Mr. Chairman, The buyout contract Mr. Thorne forced Elias Vance to sign only transferred IP, created subsequent to the company's formation. It explicitly failed to account for the three original, foundational patent numbers as 9,123,456, 9,123,457, and 9,123,458, which were filed under the Delta Trust in 2012, 2 years before this company was formally incorporated. She paused, delivering the final, catastrophic revelation: the technology you are presenting to the market, the technology you are claiming is exclusive and worth billions, is legally not. Furthermore, the Delta Trust, acting under the direction of its beneficiary, has finalized a licensing agreement with a competitor and entity we shall call Exodus to utilize this superior, foundational IP. The full implication of the betrayal landed with terrifying force. The whispers about the unlicensed IP and the disruptive rival were not rumors, they were facts. Greg hadn't just stolen the company, he had stolen the house but missed the deed to the land. The company was worthless without the foundational technology, and that technology was now legally available to a competitor who had already developed a superior product. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The lead underwriter, a formidable woman from a Wall Street titan, slammed her palm on the table. "This is a failure of due diligence, Mr. Thorne. You misled the board and the market. Your core asset is compromised. This IPO is dead." Greg, his face contorted by shock and disbelief, stammered a frantic defense. "It's a technicality. It's a ploy. Elias is sick. He's irrational. He's trying to sabotage us because we cut him out." Veronica fixed him with a cold, unwavering stare, a look of pure, intellectual contempt. "Elias Vance is fighting for his life, Mr. Thorne, and he has ensured that his life's work will not be controlled by your greed. By failing to secure the foundational patents, you have violated the trust of the investors and rendered the company fundamentally insolvent." The board chair, his face ashen, turned away from Greg, seeing only the looming threat of massive shareholder lawsuits. "Mr. Thorne, you have committed corporate fraud. Your emergency authority is revoked, effective immediately, and the IPO is cancelled." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Directors scrambled to salvage their positions, and underwriters stormed out, already preparing statements to distance themselves from the collapse. Greg was left sitting alone at the head of the table, his carefully constructed empire shattered by the single, obscure legal detail he was too arrogant to notice. The climax of Elias's revenge was the ultimate act of financial justice. Veronica presented the board with the only viable option to stave off immediate, irreversible bankruptcy and shareholder lawsuits, a fire sale of the remaining Quantum Leap assets to a large, desperate technology conglomerate. The company would be salvaged, but not by Greg. It would be salvaged as a shell, absorbed into a larger entity for a fraction of its original worth. Greg Thorne, the visionary who had ruthlessly betrayed his partner, was now summarily dismissed, and his entire career was ruined, tainted forever by the collapse of his fraudulent IPO. He was stripped not just of his power, but of the very public success he craved, leaving him to face the full, devastating reality of his financial and moral ruin. Elias, receiving the news via an encrypted summary from Veronica, felt no joy, only a profound, cold sense of finality. He had achieved justice. He had protected his life's work from the monster he created. The time for fighting was now over, and the time for his final act of self-determination had begun. The true taste of victory is not the thrill of crushing a rival, but the profound satisfaction of knowing that your final act of defiance serves a higher purpose. Greg Thorne's empire was in ruins, but Elias Vance, the architect of that collapse, was still fighting a war against his own failing body. The emergency board meeting had been the surgical strike. Now, the time came for the quiet, definitive closure. Quantum Leap Solutions, the company Greg had hijacked, was now a liability. Its IPO was cancelled. Its reputation was in tatters due to the IP scandal, and its core asset, the foundational technology, was legally held by the rival entity, the Delta Trust, which was controlled by Elias. The board's only option was a forced sale to mitigate the massive, impending shareholder lawsuits. The buyer was the conglomerate that specialized in acquiring distressed, technologically valuable assets, Phoenix Data. They weren't buying Greg's sales pitch. They were buying the patents Greg had negligently failed to secure. The the very patents they knew they could only legally acquire from Elias. Elias, operating with a ruthless focus that belied his physical weakness, directed Veronica Hayes in the final, extraordinary negotiation. He was not selling Quantum Leap. He was selling the Exodus project and the foundational Delta Trust patents. The price was non-negotiable, and it had a moral component that Greg Thorne could never have conceived. The price is $100 million. Elias commanded Veronica from his quiet command center, but the sale must include a clause. Phoenix Data Corp must commit $10 million annually, for the next 10 years, to the Neuro Research and Cancer Support Foundation, named after my mother. They don't just buy the technology, they buy into the legacy of hope. Veronica was stunned by the boldness, but she understood the strategic genius. Elias was not merely maximizing his profit, he was ensuring that the very financial engine that Greg had tried to steal would now be irrevocably harnessed to fight the disease that was claiming Elias's life. The negotiation was swift and sharp. Phoenix Data Corp, desperate to stabilize the market and acquire the superior technology before other rivals could emerge, agreed to every term. The $100 million valuation was paid entirely for the Exodus platform and the exclusive licensing rights to Elias's original patents, the assets Greg had dismissed as worthless. The $10 million annual charitable commitment was sealed in the contract, a perpetual, living monument to Elias's moral victory. Greg Thorne, stripped of his stock, his title, and his reputation, received nothing from the sale. The proceeds of the shell company's liquidation went to cover the fees and minimal debts he had accrued during his short, destructive reign. The system had, with final, absolute precision, corrected itself, ensuring the true creator was rewarded and the thief was punished. The immense influx of capital did not arrive in Elias's personal account. He had no use for it. It flowed directly into the legal structure he had designed, the Neuro Research and Cancer Support Foundation, the entity that represented the true culmination of his work. The foundation was not merely a passive charity, it was a powerful, focused institution dedicated to funding breakthrough research in early cancer detection and providing financial support for families struggling with the devastating costs of long-term neurological illness. Elias had been betrayed by the human element of the corporate world, but he had a fierce, enduring belief in the power of science and data. He ensured the Foundation's mandate was entirely driven by empirical evidence, using his own analytical rigor to target funding toward the most promising, often underfunded, research projects. His focus was intensely personal. He knew that if his cancer had been detected 6 months earlier, before the crippling corporate pressure, before the diagnosis was terminal, the outcome might have been different. Therefore, the Foundation's primary objective became the reduction of the silent, unseen gap between early symptoms and critical diagnosis. The money was now dedicated to saving others from the same terrible realization he had endured alone on the floor of his office. Veronica, watching her partner, her friend, transform this ultimate personal loss into a lasting, public good, realized the true scale of his triumph. Greg had fought for $1 billion valuation to buy yachts and status. Elias had fought for $100 million valuation to buy time and hope for strangers. The former members of the Exodus team, Lena and Mac, were not discarded. Elias ensured they were handsomely rewarded from the sale proceeds and were seamlessly integrated into the research arm of Phoenix Data, where they would continue to develop the compression protocol, maintaining the technical integrity Elias had always prized. His legacy, the soul of his code, was not sold. It was protected and perpetually funded. The sale was finalized 2 weeks later. Elias, too weak to attend the final signing ceremony, received the documents via Veronica at his apartment. He was no longer receiving aggressive treatment, having decided to move into palliative care, choosing quality of life over the destructive fight. He was peaceful, his mind clear, his body exhausted but resigned. He looked at the final wire transfer confirmation, the immense, undeniable number representing the fruits of his genius and the failure of his adversary. He had achieved his financial vengeance completely, using Greg's own legal oversight to finance a cause far greater than himself. He realized that the true tragedy of the corporate coup was not the financial betrayal, but the wasted talent. Greg had been so blinded by his own vanity that he failed to recognize the immense power of shared, ethical creation. He had chosen to destroy, while Elias, even facing death, had chosen to build. Elias signed the final document, releasing the patents, the act confirming the $100 million deal. This signature was unlike the one he had been forced to scribble on the hospital bed contract. That signature had been one of physical weakness and professional surrender. This one was a signature of ultimate power, the power to dictate the future. Even as his own time ran out, the money, the immense sale, was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his true legacy. He had survived the betrayal to ensure his brilliance would serve a higher, purer purpose, transforming his personal tragedy into a perpetual source of hope for countless others. He had lost the company, but he had endowed his life with an undeniable, permanent worth. His final peace was absolute, secured by the knowledge that the money Greg had tried to steal would now fight the very disease that had been the tool of the betrayal. The last piece of the story was simply his personal peace. The silence that follows a great and terrible battle is a profound, cleansing thing. Elias Vance had won his war not just against his treacherous partner, but against the shallow metrics of the life he had once pursued. The vast, turbulent world of billion-dollar valuations and corporate deceit had been silenced by a single, successful final transfer of funds. With the Exodus sale finalized, Greg Thorne ruined, and the Neuro Research Foundation perpetually funded, Elias was finally free to focus on the one fight he had initially tried to postpone, the fight for his own peace. He had moved away from the temporary apartment, choosing a small, sun-drenched condo with a sweeping view of a quiet, unpretentious city park. This new space was deliberately stripped of the technological excess that had defined his old life. There were no flashing servers, no multi-monitor setups, just a single tablet and a comfortable reading chair positioned to capture the afternoon light. His body was weak, constantly reminded of its fragility, but his mind was utterly, profoundly clear. The internal noise, the relentless pursuit of the next feature, the worry over the stock price, the fear of losing ground to a competitor, had completely evaporated. He felt a stillness he hadn't experienced since he was a child, a quietude that allowed him to hear the soft, internal ticking of his own existence. Veronica Hayes visited regularly, no longer as his strategist, but as his friend. She often brought updates, but they were no longer about the market. She spoke of the Foundation's first major grant, funding a breakthrough in blood-based early detection, a project that, if successful, could have saved Elias himself. The first $10 million grant went out today. Elias, Veronica told him, her voice filled with admiration, it is already changing the trajectory of research. You didn't just win a fight, you set a movement in motion. Elias simply nodded, a thin, peaceful smile touching his lips. The technology was always meant to serve. Greg made it a commodity. I simply returned it to its purpose. The code was just a tool. The worth is in what the tool builds for others. He realized that the relentless drive for success, the pursuit of the next milestone, the next IPO, the next valuation, had been a mask. It was a way to avoid the quiet, terrifying emptiness of his personal life. The diagnosis and the subsequent betrayal had violently ripped that mask away, forcing him to confront what truly mattered. Elias began to spend his final months in acts of quiet, meaningful connection. He reread the classics he had neglected for decades. He learned to appreciate the slow, chaotic beauty of the natural world outside his window, a world governed by biology and physics, not by code and finance. He also found a profound satisfaction in his final financial act. Greg Thorne, the man who had craved the public status of a billionaire, was now reduced to scrambling for low-level consulting contracts. His reputation ruined by the collapse of the IPO and the scandal of the IP theft. The man who had once swaggered through boardrooms was now an industry pariah, forever known as the thief who lost a company to his own greed. Greg had achieved the temporary success he desired, only to find that it was built on a foundation of absolute, enduring financial and moral ruin. Elias, by contrast, had his name permanently etched not on a tombstone, but on the charter of a life-saving foundation. He had chosen purpose over profit, and in doing so, he had secured a form of immortality that Greg could never buy. He looked back on the relentless, exhausting drive for the IPO, and saw it for what it truly was, a treadmill. The pursuit of the next percentage point of growth had consumed him, making him blind to the persistent warning his own body was giving him. He had mistaken his professional identity for his human worth. He had a final, brief conversation with Lena Costa, the engineer who had helped him build Exodus. Lena confessed she was happier working for Phoenix Data, finally having the resources and the autonomy to pursue her technical passions, all thanks to Elias's structure. You gave us the freedom to build the best product, Elias, without the pressure of the marketing machine, Lena told him. You built the real company twice. The first time was for money, Elias replied, his voice raspy but firm. The second time was for meaning. He had stripped away the superficial layers, the title, the corner office, the vast equitisha rand, found the core truth. The only thing that truly lasts is the impact you leave on the world. A concept Greg Thorne would never, could never, comprehend. The most vital lesson Elias learned was that his genius was not his compression algorithm. It was his resolve. It was the refusal to submit to the dual threats of disease and betrayal, and the capacity to use the last vestiges of his life to enact profound, enduring justice. He had created a perpetual engine of good, an organization that would use the resources he generated to give others the time he himself had run out of. The millions he earned were now dedicated to correcting the systemic failures that had allowed his illness to become terminal. Sitting by his window, bathed in the warmth of the sun, watching children play in the park below, Elias felt a perfect, crystalline peace settle over him. He was no longer Elias Vance, the founder of Quantum Leap, or the victim of corporate fraud. He was simply Elias, a man who, in his final act, had managed to reconcile the immense power of his intellect with the simple, profound necessity of his humanity. He had faced death and betrayal, and in response, he had built a final, enduring legacy that transcended the balance sheet. He had proven that a man's worth is not measured by the size of the empire he builds, but by the integrity of the life he leads and the positive change he leaves behind. He closed his eyes, his breathing soft and steady, content in the knowledge that while Greg Thorne was left with the ruins of a morally bankrupt career, his own spirit, his genius, and his final act of justice would continue to build a future full of hope and discovery long after he was gone. His life was not a tragedy, it was a triumphant story of finding true value in the face of absolute loss. The battle was finished, the victory was secured, and the peace was absolute.